Managing mobile devices and securing client communication. You might be looking at that title and thinking, well, wait a minute, how do mobile devices and securing client communication actually go together? Well, it's surprising, but they actually do in quite a few ways. If you played with Windows Config Manager 2007 back in the day, you probably were aware that there was two types of modes that your Config Manager site could exist in. One of which was what we called mixed mode, and the other which was what we called native mode. And the difference here was the fact that mixed mode used HTTP for all the communication between servers and clients. And native mode upgraded that communication to using HTTPS. So there was more security there in native mode because of that HTTPS communication. Now, back in 2007, one of the requirements to support this increased security and HTTPS and even internet-based client management was the addition of mutual authentication between the clients and the servers. And this type of authentication involves the use of certificates, but not just any kind of certificates. These are the special PKI auto-enrolled certificates, where every single device, client, server, everything in your entire infrastructure required its own unique certificate that it got from a CA. Now, as a consequence, native mode really didn't get implemented by most people back in the 2007 days. It was just too much of a pain in the neck to implement. And really, the number of people who really understand how a PKI work, there are not a lot of them out there, and implementing it incorrectly can create all kinds of problems. So back in the day, most people, in fact the vast majority of people, leveraged mixed mode. It was just simpler, and the additional HTTPS security wasn't something that people really worried about. Now, the reason why I'm including that here in this nugget is because in order to manage mobile devices using what's called the depth method, you have to actually have all these bits in play. There are, in fact, two types of methods for dealing with mobile devices. And you may just implement the light method, which is far easier. In fact, this will take me just about 2 minutes to actually show you how it works. And the light method, it leverages all of the active sync stuff that's built into Exchange to let Exchange handle all of that setting of policies on clients. But for those of us that actually want to do the depth method, which is the more method when it comes to managing these mobile devices, well, we're going to have to actually implement all the bits that are required to effectively create that monstrosity which was native mode. Now, admittedly, every so often these nuggets come up, and they're kind of like the nugget that kind of pays for the whole series. And this might well just be one of those nuggets, because I'm actually going to show you the entire step-by-step process that you would need to go through to set up a rudimentary PKI for distributing certificates around to the different clients and servers and devices in your network. This is something that is remarkably difficult to glean from Microsoft's documentation, but I'm going to go through each of the steps. And I've got a very long series of notes here over on the screen that you can't see, so bear with me when we actually get to the demonstration part of this. But I'll use that as an opportunity to A, show you the mobile device stuff and this depth management piece, and B, also show you so that you can add that additional client communication security if you want. Now, stepping back for just a minute, I want to go back to the mobile devices just really quickly, because it's very important for us to understand the difference between light management and depth management. Now, light management is effectively making use of the existing active sync functionality that's already baked into Exchange 2010. And if you have devices that are just any kind of active sync capable device that are out there, and there are a lot of them these days, the Androids, and one assumes even iDevices, and all the different essentially phones and tablet devices and whatever that exists out there. Those devices, as a function of their connection to Exchange 2010, this light management option will allow you to control the configuration of generally some of the active sync settings. When you set up a connection between Exchange 2010, then you can essentially synchronize your config manager settings and data with your Exchange settings and data, and then allow Exchange to handle managing any devices that end up connecting to it. So you're only going to get minimal management here. But it's the stuff that's in active sync as opposed to on the device itself. What's good about this is that it supports pretty much every active sync enabled device. As I said, there are a lot of them out there. Now, many of us, however, we understand that we want to do this, but maybe we've subscribed to the Windows mobile device. We drank the Kool-Aid for Windows mobile devices, and so if I've got those devices, I want to be able to, I want them to have the full management functionality, which is kind of one of the reasons why you get Windows mobile devices. Now, when I have that and I want to implement in all the stuff in order to make it work, I have to incorporate what's called depth management, and that requires all of this PKI stuff that we'll talk about here in just a minute. Now, what's important, very important and very different about this is that when we move to depth management, the devices are no longer managed from Exchange, but instead are managed from Config Manager. And so the device is going to need to actually have some way of communicating with Config Manager and your Config Manager site servers for it to be managed. There is the ability for you to create this sort of hybrid management scenario where you have some devices that are, or essentially where devices are both connecting to Exchange as well as Config Manager for some of those settings. And if you implement that, first of all, why would you? Maybe you have some devices that are Windows mobile and some devices that are just pure Android. And you want to manage the Windows devices with the depth management approach and everything else with the light management approach. Well, you can actually implement both of those at the same time. I'll show you where this setting is here in just a minute. If you do, you have to configure the mobile device settings using configuration baselines. So we talked a number of nuggets ago about how you can use configuration settings and baselines to do settings management. Well, for devices actually have their settings managed in the depth scenario via configuration settings. Okay, none of the settings are actually coming through the Exchange connector at this point. But you can actually collect hardware inventory from the Exchange connector and the Configuration Manager server at the same time. And in that case, Configuration Manager actually takes care of eliminating any duplicate data that it sees. You can also remotely wipe those devices via either mechanism, Config Manager or Exchange server. So if you're deciding to go through the depth management, obviously you're going to get a greater range of configuration deployment options, not the least of which is the ability to install applications. You do have to have device enrollment. You do have to have that functioning PKI. Now, there is one step in this whole demonstration I'm going to show you here in just a minute, and that's the part where you enter in the URL to the device to have it enroll itself with Config Manager. I just don't have a really nice looking device emulator. They exist. You can actually download them from Microsoft's website, but I don't have a really nice looking one here. So there will be a bit of and then a miracle occurs when we get to the point where we're working with the device itself. So I'll let you know when we get to that point, but just be aware that it's coming. Lastly, and this is really the most important part here, is the fact that it's generally limited to Microsoft's view of the world, which is Windows CE, Windows Mobile, Windows Phone, and then a couple of Nokia and Symbian-based devices that are out there. So these are the two types of device management options that exist, the bottom of which being this sort of complex world that requires that PKI. Now, in order to support that PKI, we're going to actually create 4 different certificates. And I want to kind of give you a feel for why we're doing these certificates. In our little world here that we've created, we have a server here that is functioning essentially as our Config Manager server. And out in the world, I'm going to have desktops and laptops, and then I'm going to have probably tablet and phone devices as well out there. Now, when I'm implementing depth management, the mutual authentication essentially means that a certificate needs to exist out here and on the device, in addition to on the Config Manager server, because each of these certificates provides each of the half in mutual authentication. For the components on the Config Manager server, we'll actually be enrolling this Config Manager server the manual way, essentially, and adding the certificate into IIS on this config manager server, so that we will have what's essentially a web server certificate here, specifically for the functions of config manager that operate via IIS. So these are things like your distribution point. There are a couple other roles that are out there as well, but any of the IIS facilitated config manager roles are the ones that are going to need that web server certificate. And this comes into play if you end up having more than one config manager server out there. So if you have the roles spread out on different servers, well, it's the IIS-based roles that you'll need to have those certificates installed too. We have two more certificates we have to have. One of which is going to be a client agent certificate here. So there's the client agent certificate. Now this client agent certificate is different from the web server certificate in that the type of authentication that it is essentially attempting to do is, in the certificate world, in the cert services world, it's a workstation authentication certificate. Okay, it says different OID than what's used for a web server. Now this is the use of this client agent certificate is a little bit different than the one that's down here for my tablet or other mobile device, because this mobile device can't actually do workstation authentication. It needs a special device certificate down here. This device certificate is different because the use of the certificate isn't workstation authentication, but instead it's the authenticated session type. Okay, and it feels like semantics, but in the certificate world, this is all extremely important. So I have certificate number 1 over here. So if I can grab my little writer back. So I have certificate 1 over here. I have certificate 2 over here, and then I have certificate 3 over here. Okay, these are what enable all of this mutual authentication to occur back and forth between all the different pieces to this puzzle. Now, we deliver this first certificate manually, but as you can imagine, there's a lot of clients out there and there's a lot of devices out there. So we also have to set up something called auto enrollment. And what auto enrollment is it's a function that's built into group policy, and specifically a group policy object that we'll create, that automates the enrollments, automates the distribution of these certificates here and also these certificates here. Okay, so that kind of makes the process of getting the certs out much easier because auto enrollment's turned on. Now you may be saying, wait a minute, I thought you said there were 4 certs. There actually is a 4th certificate here that's a special use certificate. That special use certificate is needed for the distribution point role, because the distribution point role needs to have its own special client agent certificate. That DP certificate is different because we're actually going to export the private key. Okay, the only reason why we're doing that is because we need that in order to build the distribution point. So that really is all of the stuff that has to get constructed. And as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on here in order to facilitate all this communication between machines. Now, what's also really kind of cool about this is that once you implement all this stuff, well, not only do you get devices working in your environment, but you also get your clients working across both HTTP and HTTPS, which means that you can open up your config manager infrastructure to connection to the cloud or out on the internet. Now, in 2007, this was internet-based client management. Okay, and here essentially this is those machines can exist out on an internet-based network, and if you have the right ports opened up to connect into your config manager servers, well, you can still keep those machines under management. So that's the kind of unspoken benefit of going through all this effort, but that's really what we're here to talk about in this nugget. Now, what do we have to do? So first of all, to talk about the light management piece, I'm going to just spend a minute talking about the Exchange connector. I have built the world's most rudimentary Exchange 2010 server so that you can see what the connection looks like between config manager and Exchange. And you might take a look at that and see it takes about 2 minutes to run and just go, you know what, that's all I care about. But if you're interested in going the next step, well, then these next 4 pieces are all about, implementing depth management and client security. The first thing we have to do is configure that PKI and the certificates. Then we will configure mobile device management. We'll enroll that our pretend mobile device. We'll set up some compliance settings. I will show you the very basics of how you set up these compliance settings. You know how to do it because you already know how to set up compliance settings, but the screen looks a little bit different. And then lastly, as far as deploying applications are concerned, just like with the compliance settings, I'll show you where it's at, but you know how to deploy apps. The only difference here is that instead of deploying in setup.exe, you're deploying a mobile device cab file. And that's really the only difference that you really have to worry about. The real meat of this is understanding, first of all, how to configure that Exchange connector, and then how to configure the PKI and mobile device management. So these are kind of the three big pieces that we're going to talk about here. All right, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and minimize this. And I first want to just sort of prove to you that we have Exchange services running here in this domain. This is a new server, exchange1.company.pri. And this is probably the world's most rudimentary Exchange server. I literally just built it so that it's there, so that when we come back here to our config manager server, that you will have something that the connector can talk to. We're going to start out by talking about the easy thing. Okay, this is the light management approach. And down here under the administration node, you see Exchange server connectors. If I right-click and choose to add an Exchange server, I have the option of entering in whether I'm going to connect to an on-premise server or down here a hosted Exchange server. So if you have Exchange Online out somewhere in the ether, you can actually use this to have that server manage your devices as well. Now I'm just going to use my internal address here. Again, I'm trying to keep things very simple here. Exchange1.company.pri. And then if I choose the next button here, I can choose which computer account I want to use that has the ability to execute these commandlets. Okay? In this case, it'll be the computer account. Now, I mentioned that Config Manager and Exchange need to go through a periodic synchronization so that Config Manager knows what devices Exchange has discovered, and Exchange can be told the things that Config Manager wants Exchange to then configure on the devices. That synchronization happens every day by default, and there's a delta sync that happens, looks like every 4 hours here. You can ignore mobile devices if they've been out essentially non-functioning for looks like half a year. And then which devices do you care about? All devices or those in certain containers. I'm just going to leave the default settings here because the settings screen is really where you're looking for all the different configurations that you're going to manage here with Exchange Server. So these are some pretty basic stuff. Do you want to enable internet sharing? Computer sync? Do you want to allow mobile devices that can't be provisioned? Here under password are your typical password settings. For email management are many of your typical email settings here, like popping and direct push and things like that. For security, just a couple of security settings here related to the devices that you want to enable or not allow on those machines. And then any applications that you want to prohibit. So again, not a lot here, because that's all that's really enabled vis-a-vis the ActiveSync protocol. Now down here at the bottom, I know it's hard to see, but I'm limited on screen space here, is this setting that allows me to kind of merge my Exchange Lite environment with my Config Manager depth environment. And if I do that, well then again I'm going to have to make some settings that are done via compliance settings for my devices. Okay, again, a perfect use case is if I have some that are mobile, Windows Mobile, and some that are not. So I'll leave the default setting here. I can choose next, and essentially that's the summary. So that's it. If that's all you care about, you're done. And admittedly, as you'll find out here in just a minute, for many of us that may be enough for us because what's coming up next is somewhat challenging. Now, in order to enable all this magic to happen, what we're really looking for is a site that can exist in what used to be thought of as native mode. So if I take a look at the properties of the site, I'm looking for computers that will actually communicate over HTTPS. Now, by default, they're communicating over HTTP. I will allow or I will welcome HTTPS communication if I select this checkbox, which I will here in just a minute. but I'm not requiring it. Maybe it's someday in the future I may require it, but for right now I'm just going to focus on requiring HTTP and welcoming those HTTPS communications if they exist. The other thing I really need to do here is on my distribution points and on my management points, I want to specify how those client computers are going to communicate with that DP over HTTP or HTTPS. So you'll see that exists here, and if I scroll down to the MP, well, it exists here as well. So these are kind of the things that I have to do, and in order to make them work, I've got to build that PKI infrastructure. Now, I've connected up here to dc.company.pri. This is the domain controller for this domain, and on this domain, I've installed certificate services. Now, remember that if you're going to use a fully functioning PKI, you have to have certificate services that can operate as an enterprise root CA and not just a standalone root. Remember also that in order to have an enterprise root CA, you have to have the enterprise version of Windows Server. So this is the more expensive version of Windows Server, and it's running on my domain controller. Now here under Enterprise PKI, you can safely ignore that one, but I have a CA running here called company-DC. So this is it's a certificate authority that's running again in enterprise mode. It's an enterprise root. And as an enterprise root CA, it has the ability to create these custom certificate templates. So remember, the certificate is what exists on the device and the server and the client. And each of those certificates can come from one or more templates. It's just like, think of it like a Word document template. I can have a lot of different documents that come out of that Word document template. Now, in order to create the kinds of certificates that are going to be auto-enrolled by all these devices via that magic group policy process, I have to create the specific certificate templates that define the characteristics that I need. There are going to be 4 of these that we're going to create, and this is going to take a period because we're going to duplicate existing templates and make a couple of modifications. Then, once we've done that, we'll then enroll the devices so that they can receive those certificates. So 4 certs. The first one is going to be a web server cert here. And this web server cert of type Windows Server 2003 Enterprise, I don't know why, that's just part of the config manager requirements. This is going to be the certificate that's used by the config manager servers that run IIS-based roles. Okay? So we'll call this config mgr web server certificate. When we do that, we want to make sure that this button is checked, supply in the request. Yep, we've got that. And then we want to, under security, we want to remove domain admins and enterprise admins from enroll, and then add in a group that I created called config manager servers. So here's config manager servers, and give that, I believe, a read and enroll. All right, so config manager servers, read and enroll. Okay, what this does is, and I guess I should have mentioned, I created this group called config manager servers, and the contents of that group is my one config manager server. It just makes things easier down the road. So this gives the server the ability to enroll that certificate, which we'll do here in a little bit. Okay, so this is essentially the first certificate we have to create, and as you see down here, I now have my config manager web server certificate, 1 down. Number 2 is going to be the client certificate. And for this one, what I'm looking for is workstation authentication. So this isn't so much a web server cert, it's a client to web server cert for that mutual authentication. I have to create a name here. I'm going to call this config mgr client agent certificate. If I spell it right, certificate. And in this one, I need to set, over here under security, domain computers to read and auto-enroll the certificate. Okay, this ensures that when those machines actually when they get the GPO that says, hey, auto-enroll what you can, well, this certificate says, hey, I'm auto-enrollable, go ahead and auto-enroll me. That's the second certificate. Manager client, enter a unique template name. Let's just give it another one. Client certificate here. It looks like I probably have a similar name in there. Okay. So there's my config manager web server and config manager client certificate. The third one I have to create is another workstation authentication certificate. Okay, I'm duplicating again this certificate, but in this case I'm creating a config mgr distribution point certificate. And just like before, I need to set the domain computers to, let's see here, remove. I gotcha. So remove that from enroll and enterprise from enroll. As you can see, I'm cheating here because I'm looking at my notes. Add config manager computers, config manager servers to enroll. Okay, so I don't need to deal with auto enrollment for this certificate because I'm actually going to manually enroll it here in just a minute. There is one other thing that's required, and that's what makes this a different kind of certificate. Under request handling up here for this certificate, the reason why I'm creating it is because I want to have only this one special certificate where the private key is going to be exported with a cert. Okay, there is a requirement to import the private key in a little bit later on when we import this into the distribution point. So I want to create this as a separate cert that's used for this one instance for just distribution points. Now, at no point yet have we actually dealt with devices. So the last one here is an authenticated session certificate that needs to be created for those devices that'll be auto-enrolled. In this one, we'll call this config mgr device certificate. And under, let's see here, under subject name, build from this Active Directory information. Subject name format here is going to be set to, I believe, common name, and we eliminate the UPN from the cert. Okay, so now we have essentially everything that's required in order to support those devices. All right, click OK, and poof, we got 4 certs. Told you there was going to be a bunch of work here. So now these 4 cert templates have been created. The next step is to enable these templates to be used by machines when they're going about requesting enrollment with these certificates. And that's actually done over here at the CA under certificate templates. What I'm looking for here are the 4 templates that I just created. In fact, I need to enable them by choosing New and Certificate Template to issue. There are my 4 Config Manager certs. I'm going to click OK, and as you can see, they're now available templates that can be distributed out to the different machines in our environment. Okay, so that's step 1, or maybe step 1 and step 2. The next process, or the next step in the process, is to actually enable auto-enrollment for all the desktops and laptops. This auto-enrollment is done here as a group policy object. I'm in the group policy management console here, and I've already created a GPO called Enable Certificate Auto-Enrollment. If I take a look at that GPO under Computer Configuration, Policies, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Public Key Policies, if I click on Public Key Policies, I'll see the Certificate Services Client Auto-Enrollment. And if I double-click that, the configuration model that I want is to enable auto-enrollment, and also to renew expired, update pending, remove revoked, and update certificates that use templates. Okay, when I then deploy this GPO out to the different machines in my environment, any of the certificates that are enrollable will be enrolled by those machines when they get the GPO. Okay, and you know GPOs, sometimes it takes a reboot or 2 for everything to work correctly, so give it some time for this to propagate out. Now, with this in place, that's really kind of all we have to do as it relates to the domain controller. We're done now in certificate services, sort of. We're done now with group policy because we've got to set up auto-enrollment. We haven't done anything really yet with over on the config manager server. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to flip back here to my config manager server, and what I'm looking for is the certificates console. So if I'm taking a look here at the certificates MMC console, you can see that I have connected this up to the local computer certificate store. And in the local computer certificate store, under personal, there's a subfolder here called certificates, which are the computer's personal certificates. This is the location where you generally store things like web server certificates. And in fact, this is where we're going to get that web server certificate. What I want to do here is actually request a new certificate using this tool. if you've played with web server certs before, you might not have actually used this certificate enrollment tool in the past. A lot of us are used to the whole process of going to the web server, that cert SRV web page that you install with certificate services. But this is essentially the same process that's baked right into Windows that doesn't require me to go and set up the web server and all the extra effort involved with that. So here under certificate enrollment, I'm going to use the Active Directory enrollment policy, which is just the standard one right out of the box. And you'll see that I actually have this web server certificate here that I need to essentially add in to this computer. Okay, does that make sense? In addition to the web server certificate, I'm also going to enroll the DP certificate as well. By enrolling that DP certificate, that's going to get me that private key that I need in order to add it into the distribution point stuff. If I take a look at details here, you can just see some information about that DP certificate. Most specifically, that it's used for client authentication, and that it has what is really a very short validity period. In fact, you would probably want to increase the validity period so you don't have to go and redeploy out certificates like I would have to here in about a year. Same thing down here with the web server cert. This one is different in that it is for server authentication, has a longer validity period. Now, some more information, as you can see, is required to enroll for this certificate. And specifically what the cert's looking for is the alternate name down here, because it wants to be able to associate the FQDN of this server with the cert, which would be config mgr1, if I can spell it right, .company.pri. When I've got that, I click Add, so I move that over as the alternate name, and then under General, I'm going to give this a friendly name and call it config mgris or web server certificate. Click OK. If everything goes well, then I can click the Enroll button, and we should actually enroll the cert. All right, so both of these two certificates are now available on this server. I have the DP certificate and I have the web server certificate. And as you'll see, I'm not looking at properties of these certs anymore because the cert's been generated at this point. But instead, I can view the actual certificate that's here. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to do so that I can have all the bits ready for when I get asked these questions in Configuration Manager. Not the least of which is taking a look at the certification path for either of these certs. Now, if you're familiar with certs at all, you know that a cert has to have a fully trusted path all the way to its root. And in order to enable that, you install all the certs onto the computer that facilitate that entire trusted path. So it can be you, your intermediary, and your root, or just you and your root, or you and your GoDaddy root, or whatever is necessary so that all these end up without having any kind of break in that certification trust chain. What I want to do here is actually view the certificate of the root server. So the actual root certificate itself, because a little later on it's actually going to request that cert in a file. So I can copy that out to a file if I want here in a dir encoded binary x509, a .sir extension. I'm going to call this a CA root certificate. And I want to put that actually on the desktop so it can make it available for myself a little later. So there's the desktop and there's the cert. Click Next and Finish to export out that certificate, and I'm good with that one. The DP certificate also needs a little bit of export as well. And in this case, it's not going to be the root certificate, but instead it's going to be this certificate itself, so the actual DP certificate. So I'm going to copy this one to a file. I do, in this case, want to export the private key because, as you recall, we had to create this special template purely so that I could export this private key. Choose Next. I need a PFX file. And in this case, I will, I believe I just need that cert, but we'll include all the certs if possible. Choose Next. I'm going to enter in a password. This protects the contents of that private key. You need to remember that password here for just a little bit later. And then put that on the desktop. So DP certificate. Save it. And I believe everything's good. All right. Whew. We're getting there. Slowly, but we're definitely getting there at this point. So at this point, we have certificates that are auto-enrolled to clients. We now have the two certs that are installed onto the server that are required. If I had more site servers in my organization, I would need to repeat this on those site servers, this last process. And now I actually have to associate the cert that I just downloaded with IIS. Okay, so let's do that now. I'm going to bring up the IIS console here, and I'm taking a look at default website. And right here on default website, if you've played with IIS at all, you know you have to have a cert for IIS to work with HTTPS. And the way that we do that is we go here to the site bindings, we take a look at HTTPS, and we associate HTTPS with the correct certificate, which in this case is going to be that web server certificate. Okay, this is the last step in the process so that I can now communicate over either HTTP or HTTPS. So that, I believe, is the last step here, at least as it directly involves with these certs. Now we can finally, I don't know how many minutes into this nugget, begin playing with Configuration Manager again. All right, so we focused at this point on all the security pieces, but recall that this is a nugget that it's about security, but also about mobile devices. So we have to kind of change our mode of thinking for just a minute, away from certificates and onto what we need in order to facilitate the mobile device connection. One thing that we have to do is actually add a pair of additional roles to our site server, which are going to be the enrollment point and the enrollment proxy point. So these two are essentially a little website that's used to allow devices that are sitting out in the world somewhere to essentially connect into our config manager infrastructure and enroll themselves in that config manager infrastructure. If I choose next here, you'll see that it attaches itself to the default website with the virtual application name of enrollment services. It's only going to work over HTTPS, and we're going to use the computer account of the enrollment point. The enrollment point, essentially the website that we'll be using, is that website. I'm copying that website to the clipboard so it becomes useful a little later on. Against the default website, port 443 and HTTPS again. So that completes installing those two little roles. And it shouldn't take more than just a second here. If I hit the F5 button, yep, and our count of roles is now increased from 15 to 17. Okay, we've almost got every single role installed on this one computer. Now we've got a couple of different things that we have to do in order to facilitate these devices actually working inside of our infrastructure. And all of these now go back to converting the site from one that operates purely over HTTP, no security at all, to one that operates over HTTPS with that with HTTPS and all the certificates in play. Okay, so there's a couple things we have to do here. Okay, the first of which is here under, I believe it's site system. The first thing we have to do is specify an internet accessible, fully qualified domain name for this computer. Now, if you don't have a disjointed namespace where the namespace you tell everybody else is different than the one that is inside your domain, well, this can be relatively easy. I can just put in here config mgr1.company.pri and everything will work. However, if you do have a disjointed namespace, if your internal is company.pri and your external is bobsbiscuitfactory.com, well, you'll have to make sure that you have the proper DNS resolution so that the outside clients can connect up to this inside server. So that's a step that I'm not going to really talk about, but make sure that you have the proper resolution and also the correct firewall ports that are opened up from the outside to the inside. Okay? Once I specify that FQDN, what this allows me to do is actually configure some internet communication to occur to this site system. So let's first go over here to the site itself and enable some stuff over here for client-computer communication between the site items and the clients that are connecting in. You'll notice before we still have HTTPS or HTTP, but now I can choose to use the PKI's client certificate when that certificate is available. Right? So if the user has a cert, yay, good user. I'm going to allow you to connect to me over a much more secure connection. And I can choose some specifics here about which cert I'm going to use if there happen to be multiple ones there. If more than one certificate's available, I can base it off of various items if I want. If I have an existing PKI, maybe I want to use the existing certificate. Or maybe I want to generate my own that's separate for the use of Config Manager. I can do that. I've stored the certificate in the default store of personal, so I don't have to actually change the location where the certificate's coming from. Now down here on the bottom, you'll notice that no trusted root certification authority has actually been specified. So I don't actually have the entire chain all the way up to the trusted root. In order to set that, I actually have to go and find the file that I created earlier. Here's that CA root certificate. Click Open. It issues that certificate, or it opens that certificate and makes it available for use. And if I click OK, well, good. Now my root CA has been specified, and I now have all the trust chains in place to support connecting to those users. That's the last step here. Hopping back over to our site server, we have a couple of different roles that we have to adjust. The first is the distribution point role. And what we're going to do here is switch it from HTTP, which does not support mobile devices, to HTTPS, which does. And when I do that, I'm going to allow both intranet and internet connections to this machine. Now you'll notice that we have different options here, either inside, outside, or both. And if I have a multiple site hierarchy, excuse me, a multiple server hierarchy, where some machines are responsible only for dealing with the internet, and some machines are responsible only for dealing with the intranet, you can see here that I might separate those out. You could probably imagine, a few minutes ago I said, well, you're going to have to open up some ports to the internet. You probably went, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I can't open up ports to the internet. That's bad. Well, this separation of intranet from internet-only connections is what allows you to create some special hardened systems that are going to sit in your DMZ that handle the internet. Then you have a couple of hops from the internet into your inside LAN, and you end up protecting things in the ways that your security people actually like. Once I do that, down here at the bottom, I actually have to import in the certificate that I need. And that's going to be that second cert, the distribution point certificate that I exported. That second cert, and if I punch in its password, please say I punched in that password correctly, then that will enable that certificate for use. Okay, and that cert is now available for HTTP or HTTPS communication. In fact, did I set that correctly? Yes, intranet and internet for this environment. So down here under management point is the second place where this needs to be done. And just like before, I'm going to set this to internet and intranet and allow my mobile devices to actually use this management point. Oh boy, told you there was a lot of steps involved. And as you can imagine, the whole certificate thing can, you can set this up in certain ways that can cause some really big pain down the road. Not the least of which is letting your certificates expire. A little recommendation for you. If you do this and you create certs that are going to expire in 5 years or 3 years or whatever your policy states, put a little note in your Outlook calendar about 6 months before it becomes time. Because it happens all the time, where environments, they extend the lifetime of their certs and then they forget about it. Or even worse, they extend the lifetime of their certs and for some reason they got rid of the root CA or something even more awful like that. So be very careful with these certs because they do facilitate security, but they can be kind of a pain in the neck a little bit later on. There is one last thing that has to be done here in order to support mobile clients. And that is setting up the client settings here to allow users to enroll mobile devices and then to set the profile for what that mobile device is going to be. So I'm going to call this my profile. This profile essentially says that this is the management site code that's going to be used for those devices. And here are the issuing certification authorities, which in my case is going to be dc.company.pri. Also, do I have a mobile device certificate, which in this case will be the Config Manager device certificate. That profile, the next time a user attempts to enroll their certificate, well, they're going to get all the necessary stuff as a function of that client communication, that client agent. Okay, I don't know. Are you ready for? You ready to see if this is going to work? I've got my fingers crossed. Let's go over here to this other. Okay, pretend with me for a minute. Let's go over here to this mobile device that we're working on. So again, I don't have a. There are mobile device simulators actually. If you go or emulators, if you go look them up online, and getting them to work was just such a challenge, and they look really old in certain circumstances. So I figured we'll pretend today that this is the mobile device that we're working on. And on this mobile device, what I'm going to do is go to the location https config-mgr1.company.pri/enrollment server. Okay, I think earlier it might have said services, but server is where we want to go. And if I've done everything right, we'll check it out. To enroll your phone and connect to your company network, select from the list of supported devices, and if I click Windows Mobile, well, looky there. There's actually the cab file that needs to come down to facilitate that enrollment. So yay, looks like the stuff is working in the way that it needs to. And in fact, what's very important is, and this is not going to work, so I can't install it, but notice here that I'm connecting over HTTPS. So this is all very, very good and kind of gives me the confirmation that we've done everything correctly, so that if this were a mobile device, I mean it is, but it isn't, then we would be functioning and have a successful infrastructure. So there's two things now that we want to talk about. Okay, we've gone through all this effort, and what do we get as a result? Well, we've done this because we want to have all that nice, fancy, fun compliance stuff and the delivery of applications out to devices on our network. Well, okay, how do we do that? Well, the way we go about doing that is, I believe here under Assets and Compliance Settings. And what we're going to do is actually create a device configuration baseline. Now when we do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add in a configuration item, which, let's see here, I don't have one yet, so I'm going to create one separately here. So there's the baseline. And then once the baseline has been created, which is here, then I need to create a configuration item. Remember what things look like back when we were talking about configuration settings and how you had to kind of go figure out if stuff was installed, and you look at registry keys and all that other jazz that was necessary because the machine was a regular desktop. So let's call this a device configuration item. And instead of creating it as a Windows device, we're going to create it instead as a mobile device. Notice how things get just a little bit easier. Now, because they're mobile devices, there is a much more constrained set of settings that can be controlled on those mobile devices. It's bigger than what it was with the Exchange way and the light deployment way, but it's still not as big as a full Windows instance. So all of these settings groups now become possible for configuration. Similar password stuff, but a little bit more granular now. Similar email management, but a little more granular now. Security items, peak synchronization items when we consider peak versus non-peak. Some roaming items here for how do we want to manage them when they're roaming. Encryption items that weren't here before. Wireless communication items that weren't here before. And what wireless networks do we want to set these things up with? Even certificates. And which certificates do we want to install on those mobile devices? What are our supported platforms here? Windows Mobile 6.1, 6.5, and Symbian. And then what's also the platform exclusions for this CI? So this is essentially how you will go about deploying these items out to your devices. And just like before, and I'm not going to save this, but just like before, when it comes down to the baseline, you'll need to go and deploy that baseline out. And one of the very first things you're going to do is deploy it out to a collection of devices. So once those devices start coming in, you'll be able to generate your own collections that is associated with those devices. Okay, I'm not showing you really anything new here, just kind of reframing what you already know in the context of mobile devices. The last thing that you really kind of have to know is how to deploy software. And deployment of software happens here under Applications, just like the regular deploying of regular Windows software. But again, what's different here is that instead of being a Windows installer, we'll be installing typically a Windows Mobile cabinet. You'll notice there's a Nokia SIS file down here for those devices. But Windows Mobile cabinet is the cab file that is used for installing software onto a Windows Mobile device. I've actually downloaded an example cab file, so you can take a look at just what it looks like. That's the Bing for Mobile cab file here. And you'll see here that if I select it, well, then that creates that application, and then I can add in all the other information that I need, that I want to. Admin comments, manufacturer, software version. Do I want users to uninstall? Do I want to sign the content file? Are there any requirements for how the device is configured before it can actually receive this content? So all of this is relatively similar to how you go about creating and deploying applications in the real world, in the desktop and laptop world, but just refactored for focusing on cab files as opposed to setup.exe and setup.ini files. Once I've got everything up here and I've got it uploaded to my distribution points, I will deploy these in the very same way that I would before, directly to the collections that support my mobile devices. All right, so that is pretty much that. What have we talked about in this nugget? Honestly, what haven't we talked about in this nugget? We have gone the breadth and depth of everything having to do with securing client communication. And then we've taken that and focused it in not only on improving the security posture for all the communication between servers and clients and servers and other servers, but also how you can use that to enable the management of your mobile devices. We talked about how essentially these two tasks rely on each other. Securing client communication and managing those mobile devices all start the same with enabling that HTTPS, and the mutual authentication being the requirement that creates all this nightmarish headache that we have to put into place. We talked about the two methods for mobile device management, the light approach and also the depth approach. For the light approach, we configured that Exchange connector, and then for all of these, we went through that extremely detailed activity of setting up that PKI, configuring mobile device management, enrolling a device, and then doing some configuration and application deployment to those devices. I hope this has been informative for you, and I absolutely want to thank you for listening.